Hey guys, so part of this week is that we're actually going to read an essay by a man named George Orwell, and he was British. The title of the essay is called Shooting an Elephant, and you guys are going to do some FSA practice reading tests, or FSA practice like reading test style questions after we go through the essay together. And it is going to be a test grade. So you're going to want to make sure that you are listening, that you are following along with the text that I am going to post, and that you're doing your best with the questions. So anyway, George Orwell was a British author, and he wrote this essay. It is based on a true story of something that happened to him when he was working as a British Imperial Police officer in India. I think it was the 1940s when India was being imperialized by the British. So I always like to read this essay with students as we're reading Things Fall Apart because it's really similar kind of themes, which is like the impacts of imperialism and colonialism on obviously the people who are being colonized, in this case the Indians, but also what's interesting about George Orwell is that it really emphasizes the impact on him as a European in this time period. Now, with Things Fall Apart, that is unique in the sense that it is telling a story of imperialism and the impacts of imperialism from the eyes of somebody who's being colonized. So Chinua Achebe obviously was Igbo, so he was that perspective. George Orwell is more what we're used to reading because this is from the perspective of the colonizer, so the Westerners. But again, even with George Orwell, you're going to see that his perspective of imperialism is a little bit different than what a lot of like Western leaders wanted us to kind of think that imperialism was. Okay, so make sure you're following along in the text as we read. We're looking at paragraph 1. In Molmine, in Lower Burma, I was hated by large numbers of people. The only time in my life that I've been important enough for this to happen to me. I was subdivisional police officer of the town, and in an aimless, petty kind of way, anti-European feeling was very bitter. No one had the guts to raise a riot, but if a European woman went through the bazaars alone, somebody would probably spit Beetlejuice over her dress. As a police officer, I was an obvious target and was baited whenever it seemed safe to do so. When a nimble Burman tripped me up on the football field and the referee, another Burman, looked the other way, the crowd yelled with hideous laughter. This happened more than once. In the end, the sneering yellow faces of young men that met me everywhere, the insults hooted after me when I was at a safe distance, got badly on my nerves. The young Buddhist priests were the worst of all. There were several thousands of them in the town, and none of them seemed to have anything to do except stand on street corners and jeer at Europeans. So this first paragraph is really kind of setting the scene for us so that we know what his life was like on a daily basis. We usually think of somebody who's a police officer as somebody who is, his job is to protect citizens. We usually think of citizens as respecting them. But in this first paragraph, we're seeing that this kind of climate of imperialism has created this really volatile, tense kind of relationship between George Orwell, who is the police officer, the European police officer, and the Burmans, the Indian natives that he was kind of imperializing or taking charge over. They really disliked him. And it wasn't just him personally, obviously, it was every European. We're in paragraph 2. All this was perplexing, which is confusing, and upsetting. For at that time, I had already made up my mind that imperialism was an evil thing, and the sooner I chucked my job and got out of it, the better. Theoretically, and secretly, of course, I was all for the Burmese and all against their oppressors, the British. As for the job I was doing I hated it more bitterly than I can perhaps make clear. In a job like that, you see the dirty work of empire at close quarters, the wretched prisoners huddling in the stinking cages of the lockups, the gray, cowed faces of the long-term convicts, the scarred buttocks of the men who had been bogged with bamboos, All these oppressed me with an intolerable sense of guilt. But I could get nothing into perspective. I was young and ill-educated, and I had to think out my problems in the utter silence that is imposed on every Englishman in the East. I didn't even know that the British Empire was dying. Still less did I know that it's a great deal better than the younger empires that are going to supplant it. All I knew was that I was stuck between my hatred of the empire I served and my rage against the evil-spirited little beasts who tried to make my job impossible. There's a few things so far in paragraph 2 that are happening. We are getting insight into the character of George Orwell and kind of his feelings about imperialism, which surprisingly, probably for us, are very negative. We would think somebody that's in a position of power that is from the colonizer culture would probably enjoy or, at least not be angry about the position that they're in. But George Orwell is revealing to us that he actually had a really hard job, that he was really hated, and that he had very kind of conflicting, mixed feelings about the Indians, the Burmans around him. He hated his empire for what it was doing because he saw what it was doing. He saw the oppression that his country was putting on these people. But it's hard to have a lot of empathy for somebody when they hate us and when they're doing everything in their power to make our lives miserable. And the Burmans are rightfully doing that to him. With one part of my mind, I thought of the British Raj as an unbreakable tyranny, as something clamped down. In sacula saculorum, upon the will of prostrate peoples. With another part, I thought that the greatest joy in the world would be to drive a bayonet into a Buddhist priest's guts. Feelings like these are the normal byproducts of imperialism. Ask any Anglo-Indian official if you catch him off duty. One day, something happened which in a roundabout way was enlightening. It was a tiny incident in itself, but it gave me a better glimpse than I had had before of the real nature of imperialism, the real motives for which despotic governments act. Early one morning, the sub-inspector at a police station the other end of the town rang me up on the phone and said that an elephant was ravaging the bazaar. A bazaar in India is like a marketplace, basically. Would I please come and do something about it? I didn't know what I could do, but I wanted to see what was happening, and I got onto a pony and started out. I took my rifle, an old .44 Winchester, and much too small to kill an elephant, but I thought the noise might be useful in terrorum. Various Burmans stopped me on the way and told me about the elephant's doings. It was not, of course, a wild elephant, but a tame one which had gone must. It had been chained up as tame elephants always are when their attack of must is due, but on the previous night it had broken its chain and escaped. Its mahout, the only person who could manage it when it was in that state, had set out in pursuit, but had taken the wrong direction and was now 12 hours' journey away, and in the morning the elephant had suddenly reappeared in the town. The Burmese population had no weapons and were quite helpless against it. It had already destroyed somebody's bamboo hut, killed a cow, and raided some fruit stalls and devoured the stock. Also, it had met the municipal rubbish van, and when the driver jumped out and took to his heels, had turned the van over and inflicted violences upon it. I don't know very much about elephants, and I don't know what must is, but you'll notice in the text that it is in quotation marks, which suggests that Orwell anticipates that his audience probably does not know what must is either. And so a lot of the descriptions about the elephant in this paragraph suggest that an attack of must for an elephant is maybe a period of time where it kind of like goes a little bit crazy. And you can think of other animals that are like this. Like for me, when I think of like cats, for example, female cats, there's times where they go in heat, and when they're in that period, it's like their hormones are doing crazy things and they kind of behave a little bit differently than they do when they're not in that moment. So I think for must, elephants go kind of crazy. And there's a lot of details in this paragraph that really emphasize not just the behaviors of this elephant, but also how dangerous it is. I think a lot of Westerners, our exposure to elephants is limited to like going to the zoo and seeing them. And I don't know about you, but for me, I think of elephants as being kind of gentle, beautiful creatures. And so he's providing a lot of details in here to kind of shift our way of thinking and help us to see that these are actually like they're huge, dangerous, powerful creatures. That last detail in the end of this paragraph tells us the elephant actually turns a van over and like destroys it. So this is really scary. We also learn in this paragraph that the Indians, the Burmese, they don't have any weapons. So that suggests something about imperialism as well, that perhaps the British have taken all of their weapons from them, and so they're powerless to defend themselves. Paragraph 4. The Burmese sub-inspector and some Indian constables were waiting for me in the quarter where the elephant had been seen. It was a very poor quarter, a labyrinth of squalid bamboo huts, thatched with palm leaf, winding all over a steep hillside. I remember that it was a cloudy, stuffy morning at the beginning of the rains. We began questioning the people as to where the elephant had gone, and as usual, failed to get any definite information. That's invariably the case in the East. A story always sounds clear enough at a distance, but the nearer you get to the scene of events, the vaguer it becomes. That right there, that comment, that quote, is an indirect comment on imperialism. And what he's saying, I think, with that quote is that when you are far away from the realities of imperialism, where one culture comes in and kind of takes over another culture, it all seems very clear and very black and white. And like the case with Africa, when we were doing background research, a lot of the Westerners believed that we were coming in and we were helping the Africans. We were utilizing resources that they had that they were not taking advantage of. And so from the outside, from very far away, it looked like we were doing something helpful and something good. But what he's saying in this comment is that the closer you get to the actual reality of these situations, whether it's the situation specifically with the elephant or the situation with imperialism, the harder it becomes to see things clearly. That is insight to kind of his life and how close he is to the situation and how convoluted and crazy and mixed up, morally this is for him. So it's really cool how the author, George Orwell, does that. He says that in this single quote. And I'm going to start by reading that quote again. He says, that is invariably the case in the East. A story always sounds clear enough at a distance, but the nearer you get to the scene of events, the vaguer it becomes. Really cool dual meaning there. Some of the people said that the elephant had gone in one direction. Some said that it had gone in another. Some professed not even to have heard of any elephant. I had almost made up my mind that the whole story was a pack of lies when we heard yells a little distance off. There was a loud, scandalized cry of, "Go away, child! Go away this instant!" And an old woman, with a switch in her hand, came round to the corner of a hut, violently shooing away a crowd of naked children. Some more women followed, clicking their tongues and exclaiming. Evidently, there was something that the children ought not to have seen. I rounded the hut and saw a man's dead body sprawling in the mud. He was an Indian, a black Dravidian coolie, almost naked, and he could not have been dead many minutes. The people said that the elephant had come suddenly upon him round the corner of the hut, caught him with its trunk, put its foot on his back, and ground him into the earth. This was the rainy season, and the ground was soft, and his face had scored a trench a foot deep and a couple of yards long. He was lying on his belly, with arms crucified and head sharply twisted to one side. His face was coated with mud, the eyes wide open, the teeth bared and grinning with an expression of unendurable agony. Never tell me, by the way, that the dead look peaceful. Most of the corpses I have seen looked devilish. The friction of the great beast's foot had stripped the skin from his back as neatly as one skins a rabbit. As soon as I saw the dead man, I sent an orderly to a friend's house nearby to borrow an elephant rifle. I had already sent back the pony, not wanting it to go mad with fright and throw me if it smelt the elephant. So here we take a really horrendous, difficult turn in the description of what the elephant is capable of doing. Paragraph 5. The orderly came back in a few minutes with a rifle and 5 cartridges, and meanwhile some Burmans had arrived and told us that the elephant was in the paddy fields below, only a few hundred yards away. As I started forward, practically the whole population of the quarter flocked out of their houses and followed me. So you really need to visualize when you're trying to read something that's this descriptive. You really need to try to visualize what the picture is that the author is creating in your mind. So you can see this dead man that the elephant destroyed, stepped on and destroyed in the mud. And George Orwell asks where the elephant has gone. He sends somebody to go get an elephant rifle, so a weapon that's capable of actually killing the elephant. And people tell him that he went to the paddy fields, which are fields where they grow like rice. And so he heads there with this elephant rifle, and everybody starts following him. So all of these men and women and children that he polices over, all of these Burmans, are following him as he goes toward this elephant or to find this elephant with this rifle. They had seen the rifle and were all shouting excitedly that I was going to shoot the elephant. They had not shown much interest in the elephant when he was merely ravaging their homes, but it was different now that he was going to be shot. It was a bit of fun to them, as it would be to an English crowd. Besides, they wanted the meat. It made me vaguely uneasy. I had no intention of shooting the elephant. I'd merely sent for the rifle to defend myself if necessary. And it's always unnerving to have a crowd following you. I marched down the hill, looking and feeling a fool, with the rifle over my shoulder and an ever-growing army of people jostling at my heels. At the bottom, when you got away from the huts, there was a metalled road, and beyond that a miry waste of paddy fields 1,000 yards across, but not yet plowed, but soggy from the first rains and dotted with coarse grass. The elephant was standing 8 yards from the road, his left side towards us. He took not the slightest notice of the crowd's approach. He was tearing up bunches of grass, beating them against his knees to clean them and stuffing them into his mouth. So this scene that you're visualizing here, George Orwell is marching toward this elephant. He has found it. He has spotted it in this beautiful rice paddy, okay? And he's just standing there, and he's pulling grass, and he's kind of beating it on his knees to clean it, and then he's eating it. He's not doing anything vicious right now. Orwell realizes that this crowd of people behind him is watching him and expecting him to shoot this elephant. And this reminds me of situations where, if you've ever been in the middle of rising tensions and it seems like there might be a fight coming and you're approaching somebody that you have an issue with, and everybody, let's imagine that we're in the school, everybody is kind of they can sense this tension and they're kind of watching you and they're waiting to see what happens, especially for young men. This is the moment where you have to decide that either you are going to throw a punch or you're going to look like an idiot and you're going to look weak and you're afraid. And so you can kind of anticipate what's going to happen here. And even though Orwell doesn't want to shoot this elephant, what he's probably going to feel obligated to do. So we're in paragraph 6 now. I had halted on the road. As soon as I saw the elephant, I knew with perfect certainty that I ought not to shoot him. It's a serious matter to shoot a working elephant. It's comparable to destroying a huge and costly piece of machinery. So this metaphor that Orwell gives us right here is designed to help a Western audience, so people like you and I, understand the value of an elephant. It's kind of like if you destroy somebody's vehicle or some big expensive piece of machinery, like it will cost somebody a lot of money, so it's not something that you do. And obviously one ought not to do it if it can possibly be avoided. And at that distance, peacefully eating, the elephant looked no more dangerous than a cow. I thought then, and I think now, that his attack of must was already passing off, in which case he would merely wander harmlessly about until the Mahout came back and caught him. Moreover, I didn't in the least want to shoot him. I decided that I would watch him for a little while to make sure that he did not turn savage again and then go home. So this paragraph is starting to portray this elephant as not some crazy killing machine like he was portrayed in the previous paragraphs. It sounds like his must is wearing off, that he is calming down, that he is being a gentle giant again, and that there's no legitimate reason why Orwell should have to shoot him. Paragraph 7. But at that moment, I glanced round at the crowd that had followed me. It was an immense crowd, 2,000 at the least, and growing every minute. It blocked the road for a long distance on either side. I looked at the sea of yellow faces above the garish clothes, faces all happy and excited over this bit of fun, all certain that the elephant was going to be shot. They were watching me as they would watch a conjurer about to perform a trick. They did not like me, but with a magical rifle in my hands, I was momentarily worth watching. And suddenly I realized that I should have to shoot the elephant after all. The people expected it of me, and I had got to do it. I could feel their 2,000 wills pressing me forward irresistibly. And it was at this moment, as I stood there with the rifle in my hands, that I first grasped the hollowness, the futility of the white man's dominion in the East. Here was I, the white man with his gun, standing in front of the unarmed native crowd, seemingly the leading actor of the piece, but in reality I was only an absurd puppet, pushed to and fro by the will of those yellow faces behind. I perceived in this moment that when the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom that he destroys. He becomes a sort of hollow, posing dummy, the conventionalized figure of a sahib. For it is the condition of his rule that he shall spend his life trying to impress the natives. And so in every crisis, he has got to do what the natives expect of him. He wears a mask, and his face grows to fit it. I had got to shoot the elephant. I had committed myself to doing it when I sent for the rifle. A sahib has got to act like a sahib. He has got to appear resolute, to know his own mind and do definite things. To come all that way, rifle in hand, with 2,000 people marching at my heels, and then to trail feebly away, having done nothing? No, that was impossible. The crowd would laugh at me, and my whole life, every white man's life in the East, was one long struggle not to be laughed at. But I didn't want to shoot the elephant. I watched him beating his bunch of grass against his knees with that preoccupied, grandmotherly air that elephants have. It seemed to me that it would be murder to shoot him. At that age, I was not squeamish about killing animals, but I had never shot an elephant, and I never wanted to. Somehow it always seems worse to kill a large animal. Besides, there was the beast's owner to be considered. Alive, the elephant was worth at least 100 pounds. Dead, he would only be worth the value of his tusks, 5 pounds possibly. But I had to act quickly. I turned to some experienced-looking Burmans who had been there when I arrived and asked them how the elephant had been behaving, and they all said the same thing. He took no notice of you if you left him alone, but he might charge if you went too close to him. So paragraph 7 and 8, I think, are really interesting. Paragraph 7 is it's a comment on a human condition that I think all of us have either experienced ourselves or we are kind of aware of. Maybe we've experienced it in other people. So the metaphor that I gave you guys, the comparison that I gave you guys before, is like if in high school situation, especially with young men, you are approaching somebody in an antagonistic way, meaning that like you are really angry with them for whatever reason and you're like wanting to confront them. People notice that, especially in a high school situation, and they start to kind of come around and watch, and they anticipate a fight. If you're the person that is approaching somebody else, I think a lot of times you realize that you've put yourself in a position where you either do have to attack them or you have to turn away and risk losing your reputation and looking weak, looking, timid, afraid, whatever, like nothing good. That's the situation he's in. In fact, I think every leader in any capacity has experienced a situation like this where you have put yourself on display and you seem to have already made a decision about how you're going to approach the situation before you actually consciously made a decision, and then you feel like you have to follow through with that action, even if it's an action that you no longer think is the best course to take or that you no longer want to do. That's what he's in. Paragraph 7. Paragraph 8, the elephant is starting to be described in a very, they actually use the word grandmotherly, so a very personified way. And I think that this paragraph, the author does a really nice job of helping to appeal to pathos. Like, we are starting to feel bad for this elephant. It is not a killing machine. It's not trying to destroy anybody anymore. Like, this is a grandmotherly type creature that is just like gentle and minding its own business and eating grass in this beautiful rice paddy. But Orwell is telling us, like, now he has to kill him. Paragraph 9, it was perfectly clear to me what I ought to do. I ought to walk up to within, say, 25 yards of the elephant and test his behavior. If he charged, I could shoot. If he took no notice of me, it would be safe to leave him until the mayhout came back. But also I knew that I was going to do no such thing. I was a poor shot with a rifle, and the ground was soft mud into which one would sink at every step. If the elephant charged and I missed him, I should have about as much chance as a toad under a steamroller. But even then, I was not thinking particularly of my own skin, only of the watchful yellow eyes behind. For at that moment, with the crowd watching me, I was not afraid in the ordinary sense, as I would have been if I had been alone. A white man mustn't be frightened in front of the natives, and so, in general, he isn't frightened. The sole thought in my mind was that if anything went wrong with those 2,000 Burmans, they would see me pursued, caught, trampled on, and reduced to a grinning corpse like that Indian up the hill. And if that happened, it was quite probable that some of them would laugh. That would never do. There was only one alternative. I shoved the cartridges into the magazine and lay down on the road to get a better aim. The crowd grew very still, and a deep, low, happy sigh, as of people who see the theater curtain go up at last, breathed from innumerable throats. They were going to have their bit of fun after all. The rifle was a beautiful German thing with crosshair sights. I did not then know that in shooting an elephant, one would shoot to cut an imaginary bar running from ear hole to ear hole. I ought, therefore, as the elephant was sideways, to have aimed straight at his ear hole. But actually, I aimed several inches in front of this, thinking the brain would be further forward. So you see probably where he's going here in this paragraph. He's setting us up for a very morbid, slow, traumatic death of this elephant. I want to point out also that on a number of occasions in this essay so far, he is using diction that has a very theatrical connotation to it. He refers to himself as a puppet. Earlier, here when he's describing the reactions of the Burmans, the Indians behind him, he is creating this comparison to the excitement and anticipation that happens when the curtain comes up at the beginning of a production. So he's really emphasizing to us that he feels like he's kind of a player or a puppet that's doing things not because he wants to or not because it's the right thing to do, but because the people who he is supposedly controlling actually ironically have control over him. It's very paradoxical in that sense. Paragraph 11. When I pulled the trigger, I didn't hear the bang or feel the kick. One never does when a shot goes home. But I heard the devilish roar of glee that went up from the crowd. In that instant, in too short a time, one would have thought, even for the bullet to get there, a mysterious, terrible change had come over the elephant. He neither stirred nor fell, but every line of his body had altered. He looked suddenly stricken, shrunken, immensely old, as though the frightful impact of the bullet had paralyzed him without knocking him down. At last, after what seemed a long time, it might have been 5 seconds, I dare say, he sagged flabbily to his knees. His mouth slobbered. An enormous senility seemed to have settled upon him. One could have imagined him thousands of years old. I fired again into the same spot. At the second shot, he did not collapse, but climbed with desperate slowness to his feet and stood weakly upright with legs sagging and head drooping. I fired a third time. That was the shot that did for him. You could see the agony of it jolt his whole body and knock the last remnant of strength from his legs. But in falling, he seemed for a moment to rise. For as his hind legs collapsed beneath him, he seemed to tower upward like a huge rock toppling, his trunk reaching skyward like a tree. He trumpeted for the first and only time, and then down he came, his belly towards me, with a crash that seemed to shake the ground even where I lay. I got up. The Burmans were already racing past me across the mud. It was obvious that the elephant would never rise again, but he was not dead. He was breathing very rhythmically with long, rattling gasps, his great mound of a side painfully rising and falling. His mouth was wide open. I could see far down into caverns of pale pink throat. I waited a long time for him to die, but his breathing did not weaken. Finally, I fired my 2 remaining shots into the spot where I thought his heart must be. If this is not getting to you, like you are not visualizing it, this is one of the saddest scenes ever of this guy like trying to kill this elephant for no reason except for his own pride and fear of being thought weak. This, by the way, is a conquo. Like, fear of fear is his ultimate downfall. And that's what's happening with George Orwell here. And just this long drawn out description with all of the imagery of this elephant, like not dying, but dying slowly, is creating this appeal to pathos that is just super emotional and really hitting home for those of you that are allowing yourself to visualize it. This word here, when he says, finally I fired my 2 remaining shots into the spot where I thought his heart must be, this is another like foreshadowing. Like it mentions something similar to this when it, like before he fired the first shot into what he thought was the elephant's brain. And so now he's shooting where he thinks the elephant's heart is. So this, again, it's like, oh my gosh, like this poor elephant is just not going to be put out of his misery. The thick blood welled out of him like red velvet, but still he did not die. His body didn't even jerk when the shots hit him. The tortured breathing continued without a pause. He was dying, very slowly and in great agony, but in some world remote from me where not even a bullet could damage him further. I felt that I had got to put an end to that dreadful noise. It seemed dreadful to see the great beast lying there, powerless to move and yet powerless to die and not even be able to finish him. I sent back for my small rifle and poured shot after shot into his heart and down his throat. They seemed to make no impression. The tortured gasps continued as steadily as the ticking of a clock. Can you imagine, like, dying slowly? Like, somebody thinks they're shooting you in the brain, but they're not. And then they think they're shooting you in the heart, but they're not. And you're just lying there and you can't move and you can't breathe and you're dying, but you're not dying. And then they keep trying to kill you and put you out of your misery. But instead of just like letting you die a slow, agonizing death, you're getting like rained with bullets, like just hitting you and not killing you. I mean, it's horrifying to read this description. In the end, I couldn't stand it any longer and I went away. I heard later that it took him half an hour to die. Burmans were bringing dash and baskets even before I left, and I was told they had stripped his body almost to the bones before the afternoon. Afterwards, of course, there were endless discussions about the shooting of the elephant. The owner was furious, but he was only an Indian and he couldn't do anything. Besides, legally, I'd done the right thing, for a mad elephant had to be killed, like a mad dog, if its owner fails to control it. Among the Europeans, opinion was divided. The older men said I was right. The younger men said it was a damn shame to shoot an elephant for killing a coolie. Coolie being the Indians. Because an elephant was worth more than any damn Korangi coolie. And afterwards, I was very glad that the coolie had been killed. It put me legally in the right, and it gave me a sufficient pretext for shooting the elephant. I often wondered whether any of the others grasped that I had done it solely to avoid looking a fool. All right, so that's shooting an elephant. You need to go on to the next slides and answer the questions. Remember that this is a test grade, so do your best on it. I'll talk to you later.